Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. With the support of the Alfred and Jane Ross Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Rockefeller Family and Associates, Donald M. Kendall, and Booz and Company.
Hello, I'm David Speedy, and our guest today is Anatol Lieven from King's College London.
A better understanding of the complex socio-cultural forces in Pakistan could help the U.S. shape a morally responsible policy toward the country, according to author and regional expert Anatol Lieven.
Hello, I'm David Speedy, and our guest today is Anatol Lieven, Professor of International Relations and Terrorism Studies in the War Studies Department of King's College London. Anatol, welcome back
Hello,
to the Carnegie Council. Always a pleasure to have you. I know it's been a whirlwind tour, so thank you for joining us. We are here to talk about primarily about your new book, Pakistan, A Hard Country. In part of the blurb on the book, it says that you look at the disparate, often conflicting, but surprisingly potent forces that hold the fractured country together. And at one point you quote from Galileo, "Eppur se muove," I hope my Italian is up to that, and yet it moves. And a different part of the book you talk about islands of successful modernity. So it really is a paradox here, isn't it? There are forces that promote the development of the country, but at the same time hinder. It's a constant paradox that you're exploring, isn't it?
Yes, a friend who introduced me at one of my talks in America said that, if you're looking for simple explanations and simple answers to the problems of Pakistan and US relations with Pakistan, then this book is not for you. No, it is a hellishly complicated...
We do tend to look for simple answers, of course, in this country and probably beyond. But,
Well, America is not going to find them in Pakistan, I fear.
One thing that probably ought to be put out at the outset, too, is that, again, one of your admiring critics say that Lieven has gathered the thoughts, words and opinions of hundreds of Pakistanis, all classes of walks in life, to present a compelling portrait of the country. This is terribly important, isn't it? I mean, you and I have talked before about others who sort of parachute into Pakistan and perhaps, touch down in Islamabad and have a few meetings and leave. But you've really spent time and literally covered the country in this book and preparation for it.
Yes, and not, I have to say, most of the tribal areas, as you can see from the fact that I'm here and in one piece rather than two. But other than that, yes, I've spent a considerable amount of time in each of the provinces. I've talked to as many ordinary Pakistanis on the street as I could and garnered their opinions.
And that, of course, speaks again to the complexity of the country, because the various provinces, it's not a homogeneous entity by any means, obviously, and that's part of both the paradox and the problem of the modern state of Pakistan.
I mean, that is one of the many things that holds it back in terms of economic progress. On the other hand, there is a possibility in some circumstances of an Islamist revolution in Pakistan, but it wouldn't lead to an Islamist state like in Iran. It would lead to chaos, disintegration, civil war. And actually, because enough Pakistanis know that, that's an additional barrier to revolution, because there's a strong awareness, I think, that that it would in fact destroy the country and lead to utter misery for tens of millions of people.
Let's look at, if I may, at some of the specific aspects of this paradox that is Pakistan that you cover in really admirable detail in the book. First of all, the justice system and rule of law. You write that Pakistanis with even the most limited power to do so have contributed to the wreckage of the state judicial system by their constant efforts to twist it to their own individual or group purposes. And you talk about continual struggles for power that permeate Pakistani society, the fragmentation in the form of what you call customary laws. I mean, clearly there's sort of an anarchic flavor to this.
Well, that's it, because we tend to see the struggle for the judicial system in Pakistan as between state law, which is basically British law by origin, and the Sharia. But in fact, a great many people in the countryside, and even some of the cities across Pakistan, in fact, they follow their ancient customary tribal law. Unfortunately, that while it has certain positive aspects in terms of maintaining, basic peace, it's savagely oppressive to women in particular. In fact, as I remark in the book, the British used to prefer the Sharia to tribal law because the Sharia was actually a relatively progressive code by comparison, which tells you something, alas.
On the military, clearly the military has been fundamentally and is fundamentally important, both as a power broker, at times a power taker. I've heard it described as perhaps the only stable aspect of Pakistani society, but again, the paradox comes into play here. I'm struck by 2 points that you make in the book. First, you say, the Pakistani military likes to think of itself as a big family, and in some ways it is more like a big Pakistani family than it likes to think.
Yes.
And then you say, since 9/11, the Pakistani military has been forced into an alliance with the U.S. that a majority of society, including the soldiers' own families, detests. So clearly, again, there's a tension here, both in terms of within Pakistan itself and in terms of our relations with the country.
Well, my point about being like a big family is that big Pakistani families basically use their power to exploit the state, to plunder the state. And the Pakistani army has done that on an enormous scale. On the other hand, its discipline, its esprit de corps, its ethos means that, this is not, a West African army. The generals haven't just stolen the money and transferred it to bank accounts in London. They have spent it on the army and even to a considerable extent on the well-being of ordinary soldiers, which is what maintains the efficiency, the loyalty of the army. But of course the loyalty of the army has been challenged in recent years by the fact that they are part of this war that most of them, at least initially, really, really didn't like. And there were serious problems of morale for several years because the soldiers were being told, even by their own families when they went home on leave, that they were acting as slaves of the Americans, killing fellow Muslims to take American money. Now, that's changed quite a bit in recent years when it comes to fighting against the Pakistani Taliban, partly because the Pakistani Taliban have emerged as an obvious threat to Pakistan, and the army is dedicated, of course, to defending Pakistan against external and internal enemies, partly because the Taliban have committed so many atrocities in Pakistan, including against soldiers who they took prisoner, which has certainly strengthened the military's willingness to fight. But I'm sorry to say as well that one of the reasons the soldiers are now fighting harder against the Pakistani Taliban is that they've been told and they believe that behind the Pakistani Taliban stands India. And their entire mindset, you see, is structured around hostility to India and fear of India. So if they're convinced that the enemy is really the Indians or being backed by the Indians, they always fight much harder, which is, encouraging in a way, since they are now fighting hard against the Islamist rebels. In other ways, it is, however, an extremely sad comment on the Pakistani mindset in general and the military mindset in particular.
The right thing for the wrong reason, and then, of course, the 800-pound elephant in the room is ISI, the international, the intersecurity, with at least suspected extremist links, particularly, I suppose, in terms of Kashmir. And you talk about strange tensions within the rest of the military. Clearly, ISI is another layer of complexity and difficulty in understanding Pakistan.
It's sometimes been a convenient fiction in both Pakistan and America to pretend that they're an independent force. I don't think that they are. Some particular operations, like perhaps the terrible Mumbai terrorist attack on India in 2008 by a group that was long linked to the military, that could perhaps have been a rogue operation by lower ISI officers. There's no doubt that ISI officers were involved, but there it's not certain that the orders came from above. But in general, the ISI obeys the orders of the military.
Yeah. Let's touch quickly on the religion question. You mentioned this in passing, but let's just develop a little bit. You say, and again I quote you, a dangerous intellectual mess is created by the mixing up of words such as extremism and militancy with very different concepts of fundamentalism and conservatism. And then of the Islamist political movements, and again you've touched on this, you say the question is not why they are so strong, but why they are so weak. That's an interesting and perhaps counterintuitive thing for an American to grasp. So again, back to the paradox question.
Well, of course, I mean, there is a strong and dangerous militant movement in Pakistan now. But, if you look at Pakistani history, and according to, opinion polls, the next elections as well, the actual Islamist parties have, with really very rare exceptions, done very poorly in the elections. They've never come anywhere near a majority.
It's been pretty constant, hasn't it? I mean, in the single digits.
That's right. I mean, that's pretty striking because, in other countries, and after all, Pakistan has had a sort of elections much more than in the Middle East. People are very poor. It has a very strong intellectual tradition of Islamism. Well, at least it was strong. It hasn't really been updated for decades now. And in parts of the Middle East, the Islamists won in Algeria until it was overturned by a military coup. They won in Turkey. They may well do extremely well in Egypt, and so it's very striking that in fact they haven't been able to develop in Pakistan. And for me that brings out above all to some extent the backwardness of Pakistan, because these modern Islamist parties, they do come out of a certain kind of modernity, especially urbanization. But it also just brings out the fact that Pakistan is so divided. It's divided into a party representing one sect of Islam will always have enormous sections of the country against it before you even get into the differences between the different provinces, different ethnic traditions, different languages, and so forth and so on. So once again, I mean, in some ways Pakistan is too divided to experience a revolution. Terrorism, of course, that's a different matter, I fear that terrorism is now going to be with Pakistan for a long time to come. But some of the most terrible attacks of terrorism have been directed by the Pakistani Taliban against other Muslim sects and shrines who they hate on theological grounds. So, of course, that doesn't do anything to win supporters in those traditions.
You make one statement that I thought was perhaps more sweeping than many. I mean, the Pakistani Muslim thinks of himself as heir to the Muslim empire descending from a race of emperors and rulers. There is a streak of militarism in Pakistan's ethos, even at their popular level. It's almost as if you do see a national sense of self or identity in Pakistan. But
I should perhaps have qualified that because it's probably not true that your ordinary farmers in Sindh or your tribesmen in Baluchistan do, but certainly in Punjab, which is the biggest province, there is that strong sense. And this reflects analysis of Pakistan by many Pakistanis themselves. The memory of how Muslims used to rule the whole of South Asia and of the prowess of Muslim warriors is, I think, very important in Pakistan. And it does strengthen this instinctive respect for the military, which periodically helps the military, of course, to seize power. Though, to be fair to the military in that regard always get an enormous amount of help from the civilian politicians and the dreadful messes that they make in the country.
And I assume the aforementioned and incorrigible rivalry with India, in this case, plays into this sense of collective identity to the extent that it exists.
Yes.
So,
I mean, there are some reasons, I suppose, for Pakistani paranoia, given the much greater size of India and the fact that India in the past has often been very hostile to Pakistan. Nonetheless, I mean, the level of paranoia and the absolutely grotesque conspiracy theories that it generates, really often do make a rational public discussion in Pakistan very, very difficult on some issues.
Let's move now to the question of the importance of Pakistan to the US, the region, and the world. You mentioned, obviously, that after Afghanistan has been settled in whatever way, Pakistan will remain as an enormously important country. You mentioned the demographic, 2/3 of the entire Arab Muslim world population of Pakistan. It's 6 times that of Afghanistan or Iraq. It's twice that of Iran, and so on. So, Dan Markey, who's at the Council on Foreign Relations, whom I'm sure you know, spoke recently about the and you also referred in the beginning to the visit of the tensions between the Pakistani intelligence and our DC officials. And he spoke about the visit following a disastrous few months during which Pakistan-US relations hit a new low. And clearly the administration has had much more emphasis on Al-Qaeda and the Afghan war than on getting Pakistan right, is his conclusion. Presumably you agree in a large extent with that, and how do we get to the point of thinking over the horizon in a sort of a more strategic way about Pakistan?
Well, it seems to me, first, that we do have to prioritize Pakistan, because of nuclear weapons, the size of the country, the fact that if, God forbid, the Pakistani army disintegrated, let alone nuclear weapons, the expertise, the munitions that would flow into the hands of terrorists that in itself would raise the terrorist threat to the West by an order of magnitude. And we need to be very clear what we can get and what we are getting out of the Pakistanis, and what our chief priority is. For me, that's clear. It's to prevent terrorism against the United States, Britain, and the West. And there the Pakistanis have generally been very helpful, sometimes given crucial help in preventing particular terrorist attacks, partly because they have no interest in promoting terrorism against the West, partly because they've been threatened with the wrath of God if a terrorist attack on American soil does take place with Pakistani links. The problem is, of course, how to balance that against our needs in Afghanistan, where, of course, the Pakistanis have not been helpful at all, to put it mildly. I have to say that partly because I myself, on the basis of my deep former experience of Afghanistan, do not believe in the possibility of victory there, I would advocate using the Pakistanis to see if we can gain some kind of settlement with the Afghan Taliban, which would then get us our main objectives in terms of excluding Al-Qaeda, cracking down on heroin, ending the Afghan civil war, and allowing us to leave. Now, for that, the Pakistanis are hopeless when it comes to fighting against the Afghan Taliban. When it comes to brokering a peace deal with the Afghan Taliban, they will be crucial if we ever decide to go for that. And, of course, if the Afghan Taliban are prepared to play ball.
In terms also of long-term strategic interests, mutual interests and so on, obviously just the question of economic investment, I think you touch on this, the question of the need for long-term trade and investment instead of just the billions in direct aid that may end up in perhaps not the best and most salubrious places for the country.
Well, let's look on the bright side. They may well end up in bank accounts in London and New York.
Ah, well. Much needed, of course, but yeah. No, but clearly you're an advocate for looking more profoundly and sensibly at investment in Pakistan as opposed to just
especially in water infrastructure, which I regard as actually the biggest long-term threat to the existence of the country. Yes, in fact,
you mentioned at some point that ecology may be the gravest long-term threat to Pakistan. That's an interesting thought, obviously, and one that, again, I think is based on a more substantial immersion in the country than perhaps others have. Speak a little about that.
Well, and this, by the way, is before one even factors in the potential effects of climate change. According to the World Bank, unless Pakistan can bring its birth rate down by a much steeper rate than it's done so far, it'll have a population of about 335 million people by the middle of the century. That is simply too much for Pakistan's water resources to support, unless there is a radical improvement in the use of those resources to cut down on waste, improve agricultural efficiency. The problem is that once again requires a very different kind of Pakistani state. It requires a much more educated population. It requires all the kinds of things that Pakistan has not been able to achieve up to now. But yes, that is a terrible looming menace in the decades to come.
So back to this question about the paradox of the particular paradox of the same forces who advance things in Pakistan but also may retard or even reverse. The subtitle of your book is A Hard Country, and clearly I think it seems obvious to me that you're dealing with hard in two senses, hard to deal with and perhaps to comprehend from an American or Western point of view, but also hard as in hardness, toughness, resilience, and so on. So where do you come down?
Well, I think urbanization, well, it will lead, obviously, to social change and change in attitudes over time. Although by no means always positive, this can lead, of course, to a great increase in Islamist radicalism, perhaps, though it hasn't done so yet. This very steep radicalization. But with luck, it will also lead to more education, to a diminution of the power of these entrenched elites, with their tremendous resistance to positive change. But the thing is, you see, one of the things that gives the system its resilience, but its resilience against revolution, but also its resilience against, positive change, was summed up by the epigraph that I actually wanted, but it would have cost too much, which was from Bruce Springsteen, a song called Highway Patrolman, the refrain of which goes, "Man turns his back on his family, he ain't no good." The thing is that, so many of these structures in Pakistan, we see them as purely negative, but they're rooted in profound loyalty to kinship ties, and that's what gives them their toughness. But that also, of course, gives them their ability to resist, all the kind of positive developments that we want to see.
Well, as a good New Jerseyan, I, of course, appreciate and understand fully the Springsteen ethos here. So, two final questions, perhaps, on regional issues, Anatol. The first, last time you were here, we spoke of clearly the strategic importance in the context of an extended region for an Afghan solution. For example, India, Russia, China, even Iran, where there is a confluence of interest with the U.S., although it's not immediately evident to U.S. officials. How do you see that? Has there been any movement in that, positive movement in that direction, as far as you see, of looking at more broadly at a regional solution?
Well, glacial. I've been part of some track 2-ish stuff, as it's called, private conferences between Indians and Pakistanis and so forth. And it has at least got to the point where I think sensible people in both the Pakistani and the Indian security establishments realize that they won't get everything, neither side will get most of what they want in Afghanistan. They'll have to settle for something less. Once you get to that point, you can then begin to talk about possible compromises. There has been just the beginning of both of greater Russian involvement in Afghanistan, but also just the beginning of Russian thinking about whether it might be possible via Pakistan to do some kind of a deal with the Taliban that would meet Russian fears both of international terrorism, of course, directed against them, but also something which isn't talked about nearly enough in America because it doesn't really affect America, but is of tremendous importance to Russia and Europe, which is heroin. The only force in Afghanistan for 30 years now which has been able to suppress the heroin trade, for its own reasons, of course, in 1999-2000 was the Taliban, because they're the only people who've been able to control the countryside. So clearly, as part of any deal with the Taliban, their suppressing the heroin trade would have to be a key part of that, in return, of course, for a continuation of Western aid. I think that's something which also draws in the Iranians, who've also suffered terribly from Afghan heroin. So some of the building blocks of this, of a possible peace settlement, both within Afghanistan, but also involving the interests of the great powers, if you will, are already visible. But whether it will really be possible to put them together in a foundation for peace, that I'm not sure.
Finally, and again, we've spoken in passing about India, the chronic state of rivalry between two nuclear powers, and you do say that the West, and the US obviously involved, must do what it can to seek a peaceful solution to Kashmir. Same question. Do you see any progress, even glacial, on that score?
Very little. In fact, I have somewhat modified my position in the book. I think what we may have to settle for is a continuation of a basically Cold War relationship between India and Pakistan. But then, of course, during the Cold War, it was possible for Washington and Moscow to reach limited deals on certain areas. So I think it might be possible for India and Pakistan to reach a limited deal on Afghanistan. And it might be possible, but the US will need to invest a great deal of diplomatic attention to this, it might be possible to reach a South Asian version of START, agreeing on mutual limits on nuclear weapons. And that is, of course, of tremendous importance to us, but because, of course, of the apocalyptic threat. For me, not actually so much of the weapons themselves, but of Pakistan's nuclear materials and expertise falling into the hands of terrorists, quite apart from the risk of an accidental nuclear war. So that's the approach I would take. See if we can't, rather than going head-on at an issue which may at present be insoluble, see if we can work around it and reach limited but still crucially important agreements on other areas.
Yeah. On that note of qualified but discernible optimism, our guest has been Anatol Lieven of King's College London. His book is Pakistan, a Hard Country. A truly magisterial work, Anatol, and an enormous contribution to this enormously important country. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, David.
We hope this program was informative and provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs, with the support of the Alfred and Jane Ross Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Rockefeller Family and Associates, Donald M. Kendall, and Booz & Company. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.